Where's Shirley?
Somewhere out there. In the fire range.
Exactly.
Oh, no.
A long time. And they're about to pass the wife's mother about passed away. That's rough. I was even rougher for being the wife, because she's not doing well. At least her. What are you guys doing?
All right.
Oh, it's really good. I mean, because you guys had some big issues in the past, so it's having help coming together is really good. Well, that's just how it's going forward. Yeah, as we're getting older, we'll start having those things. So I'm lucky so far.
Yeah, I was growing up quite a bit. It's just
Oh, wow. No, it is bizarre. Teenage years. Like, who, you know, are these folk, you know, who are people that are hanging out with these adults that I know? Since it's changed so much.
Well, good morning, all. Thanks for being here today. This is what we call in the Easter cycle Low Sunday, because we had such a blast that, you know, the once a year attenders don't come back next Sunday. We always hope we'll inspire them enough to do it, but we never succeed. Couple items. First of all, I'd like to call your attention to the picture on the front page. in the very back of this huge open plaza here, in the very back, slightly off center to the left, you'll see a tiny black spot. You see it?
Yeah.
All right. Now, if you'll turn to page, I don't know, but I'm not working with a large script this time, just so I can tell you how to do this.
Page 5.
5, thank you. You'll turn to page 5, you'll see again that little black spot. That's called the door of humility. You'll notice also there's a step at the bottom of that door, if you're looking at page 5, to make it even shorter. Even I have to duck to get in that door. And I mean, really duck, I mean, head down. And you'll see an arch in the stonework above the door. Can you see the pointed arch? What does the point tell you? It was done by whom? Crusaders. And that's the original door of the Church of the Nativity. And you ask, well, why in heaven's name did they break it up? Well, that takes us to the Ottoman period when the Islamic soldiers rode their horses and the people stealing marble out of the church drove horses with wagons in through this large door. And so the monks that were in that area bricked it up. And it's called now the door of humility. It's left that way intentionally. But when you look, if I say to you now, you're looking at the Church of the Nativity, it's all the way back this huge courtyard on page 1. And that little spot is that door of humility. And what you see behind it is what's left of that. They had 2 bell towers at the top of this structure in the back that earthquakes took out in the 19th century, and they've not been replaced. But this is the Church of the Nativity, originally built by St. Helena, or really actually the Bishop Macarius of Jerusalem supervised the construction by plans supposedly from St. Helena, altogether from St. Augustine, under the command of the First Ecumenical Council of the Church in Nicaea in 325. I'll get to that in just a moment. But the church groundbreaking was done in 326 of our contemporary era, and the church was dedicated in 339. So it took 326 to 339, took 13 years to build the church. And if you look on page 2, I'll get this out of the way to make a little more sense. On page 4, upper right hand, you'll see the floor plan of the current Church of the Nativity. But this is not the one St. Helena started and initiated. This is built after the first church was burned to the ground during one or the other of the 2 Samaritan insurrections, when the Samaritans, remember who the Samaritans are, they're the remnant of the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom who have never been accepted among the returnees from exile as legitimate Jews, but who continue to have the Samaritan Torah and continue to observe Passover and other Jewish festivals, but by Samaritan tradition. Well, there was an uprising in the 6th century of the Samaritans twice, about 20 years apart, and they burned St. Helena's church to the ground, but immediately it was rebuilt by Constantine's successor of some years, and Justinian, and as a result of that, it is now in the Roman Basilica style. While we're looking at it, let's point out a couple more things. The church faces the east, as all the churches tend to do. Not all succeed at it, but even today, most liturgical churches, Lutheran and otherwise, the congregation faces east. Why? Nobody knows. Resurrection, absolutely. Looking toward the resurrection, facing the east, rising sun in the morning, the resurrection, that kind of symbolism. And most liturgical churches, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Episcopal, Lutheran, and others, are built facing the east. I'm not sure about us here, because I don't know where we are in our octagonal building when I've turned so many curves getting here. I don't have any idea where east and north and south are. It doesn't matter much, but that is a tradition. So at the bottom of this, we have the narthex. It's in the west end of this basilica, so that the church is facing due east. These black dots are columns. You'll see them in another picture here, looking at the church, one-sided, so that there are 5 aisles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then small apse on each side, shape of the cross, and then the choir chancel, then the sanctuary, and there is a petition of icons that, so the consecration is almost done by the priest in secret, but you can see through the doorway here. And then in the center, around this roundedness at the top of the cross, right below that is the cave, and there's a picture of that you'll see too. Right below that is the cave where the birthplace of Christ has traditionally been. So you can go down and you can reverence the site of the birth of Christ if you wish. And that's right directly below this little circle at the top. You follow me what I'm saying? And so having told you something about the graphs, now something about the paper. And if I get a little flaky today, more than usual, always, if I get a little flaky today, we were at Salem, Virginia, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday morning. And we got back about 4:30 yesterday afternoon. And Doris had, bless her heart, read this paper and just told me I had a lot of work to do. Well, we got home at 4:30. I had driven for 6 hours. Finally, I finished this Thursday at 9 o'clock. I hope I printed our copies here. I hope they read out online, you folks that are with us online. But at any rate, if I get a little flaky, it's that's the reason I wrote this on Monday and Tuesday. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Merciful and gracious Lord, we thank you for every Lord's Day. Particularly, we thank you in this Easter season as we remember our series of Sundays for the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, which we can celebrate in the Sundays of Easter. So be with us now. Be also with the suffering in this world, with the displaced, with the frightened, with those who have lost loved ones. We pray for the Ukraine and for the issues there. And we ask the gift of your Spirit, and give us again, Father, the joy of justice. We ask all these things in your name. Amen. I don't know how many of us are aware that what we're watching on television is being enabled to some degree by a church. The Ukrainians, when they received their independence from the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union began to crumble 30 years ago, or is it 40, petitioned the church to have their own archbishop. Remember, we've been talking about the Orthodox Church having many autocephalous bodies. That means it mostly independent, having their own bishop. Well, there is a bishop of Russia, that Russian Orthodox Church is autocephalous. It is its own boss about most things. And when the Ukraine pulled out, they lost this huge section of some of their stronger churches because the Ukrainians asked to have their own bishop too. And they were granted that really without much issue back at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the Russian church, God forgive me, is encouraging Putin strongly. They embedded their Russian Orthodox priest with the brutality taking place in Ukraine. And they served the Russian soldiers who killed and raped and stole and looted a church, administered the Eucharist in those settings to the people who were doing those things. Because the Russian bishop is encouraging the Russian president. There are some evils to nationalism in all cases. This is one of them. And it's played out on our television screens every night. At any rate, how did I get off on that? Because it irritates. This is an Orthodox church here, as most of the oldest churches in Jerusalem and across the Holy Land are, because the Roman Church comes a little later. The Syrian Orthodox Church was always there. So when I meet with the Patriarch Theodorus, one of the ones I can remember his name, when I meet with him, he always says to me, Ted, you know, we were here first. So it's a funny kind of thing. But that's happening right now. And one church is encouraging war. I just need to say that. Now, not in your script. So we're going to go to the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem today as the first of the visits of places in the Holy Land, because it is the most ancient, longest serving church in the Holy Land. Even when it was burned down, Mass was held at the site until the new church was rebuilt. So, understanding, but how many remember the Music Man? Remember the Music Man? You remember the line in the Music Man? You gotta know the territory. You gotta, and it's a rhythmic kind of thing about two salesmen talking about their business as salespeople. One's going to go to River City to start a band, and the other's selling biscuits for the Unity Biscuit Company. And you hear the clicky crack in the background and clicky crack in the background, and they go into this back and forth about. And there's one, Henry, what's his name? Harold Hill is always coming in with the refrain line, but you gotta know the territory. Well, I say that today because Saint Helena, once again, the mother of Constantine, the Great, Saint Helena was an archaeologist who was an archaeologist before there was the science of archaeology. She was one who knew the territory, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And I want to talk about the four forces that came together to build this church and why in Bethlehem. Number one, there is Constantine. He is the son of Saint Helena. She is his mother. She is a Christian. She said, we think she was converted when Constantine was converted. And have another sidebar story about Constantine the Great. He was converted when he defeated his alternate emperor, when they had two emperors, one in Istanbul and one in Rome, for the Western Rome, Eastern Istanbul divisions of the Roman Empire. And it was falling apart because it was unmanageable. But at any rate, ends up with Constantine in battle with his competitor from the other seat of the Rome. And the night before, he sees this sign. He told this story before. Sign of the cross and hook, signal wingers, and this sign you conquer. And Constantine had his soldiers get up before the battle and paint crosses on their shields, and they won. And the rumor is, the history is, the story is that Constantine was converted by that, but he won, defeated his competitor. He is now emperor of the whole darn empire. And the first thing he does is with a colleague. Well, in fact, Sentius was one of the people he worked with before this battle came. They signed the Edict of Toleration, which ended for the last time the 250 plus years of the Roman persecution. Constantine stopped it. He passed the Edict of Toleration. And the Edict of Toleration said, you know, it was no longer illegal to be a Christian. It also had the clause in it that we will deal with them magnanimously. And they did. They could build their churches now. They were given special privilege. After that battle, within 5 years, Constantine has called the Council of Nicaea, 325 CE. And the Council of Nicaea was called, if you're looking for me on this, I'm rambling around. So I told you I'd be a little nuts today. So Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea together. That's in the eastern region of the empire, by the way, and what's now Turkey. And their assignment is to deal with the heresy of Arianism. Constantine is saying, in essence, we couldn't have a divided empire and we can't tolerate a divided church. He wasn't so much a theologian as a politician, but he was a Christian now, at least Christian sympathetic. Later stories are being told that it wasn't until the conference of I'll think about it in a minute. It's in your paper. It wasn't until the conference of Thessalonica, that's a conference of Thessalonica in 381, that Christianity was made the religion of the empire. That became officially the Roman Empire religion. But Constantine behaved as it was because he was boss and he was Christian. And so it went on with a great deal of favoritism to Christianity. And another thing, we all know, whenever we can say this Nicene Creed, we all know that that creed in 325, it came to us in 2 ecumenical councils in the 4th century. But we don't always recognize that the Council of Thessalonica was the one that made Christianity the official. That was 381, sometime later. And there's an interesting story that's now surfacing through research that Constantine was baptized just before he died in about 360, 350. And you'd say, well, that doesn't sound very Christian. But early Christians had a lot of trouble with whether, you know, when you're baptized, you're washed, you're made clean in the sight of God. And there got to be a movement of waiting till the last moment before you were baptized so you couldn't lose your cleanliness. But Constantine was a great benefactor of the church. Issue, Council of Nicaea not only decided the Nicene Creed, but they did a lot of other things. And one of the other things they did was pass an edict that there should be a restoration of Christian sites in the Holy Land. Now, remember, we're talking about 325. Christians have been severely persecuted for 250 years. There hasn't been a great deal of the life of the church that's above ground. You met in private homes. By the way, I had the joy of preaching when I visited in Russia. I had a joy of preaching on a Sunday morning in a Baptist congregation with communion, which was interesting, that met in a private home. that was behind a wall in a deep suburb of Moscow. I even almost got a ticket driving out to the church. I couldn't understand the officer, and he couldn't understand me. And finally, he said something in German and Russian, and waved me on and didn't write me the ticket. I was lucky. But anyway, at this church, there were a Baptist church that was. This is now Gorbachev's period. He invited some pastors to try to locate Christians. He was baptized. This is none of it. Why am I doing? But the issue being that this was in a private home, and they told me about their last 3 pastors who died in Siberia. So they were being supported by people from Finland. And so the minute I hit Moscow on a Saturday night, I was asked to preach Sunday morning at this church. They told me they expected me to preach about an hour and a half. Same thing as the other group I told you about. A marvelous time. Place was packed. They had a little keyboard on legs and a teenager that played the hymns. It was a strong group, but their pastors had all died in Siberia. This is what was changing during the time of Gorbachev and later beginning of the state of Russia. But it was a piece of it. At any rate, Constantine, back to the theme, Constantine becomes a very strong supporter of the Christian church. His mother goes to the Holy Land. Now, Constantine had another brother and another sister, and they were both executed by a provincial governor for some particular crime. So we don't know whether she went to the Holy Land in mourning or whether she went really as the pilgrim she turned out to be under the mandate of Constantine, and now we understand the Council of Nicaea, to find and repossess and preserve sites for Christian pilgrims to visit. She went with the money of the Roman Empire. She went with the support of her son, Constantine, who would become Constantine the Great. And she went to discover, now why we call it, that's the role of Constantine, this church in Bethlehem. Why do we call him the archaeologist of the first Christian archaeologist in the 4th century? Well, now let's see what he had in mind. Why were they having to send? Why was the Council of Nicaea concerned about sending, about rediscovering Christian sites and repossessing them and preserving them? Do you know, many people, when they go to the Holy Land, lament that it doesn't look like the Sunday school papers we used to get. In the old days, before digital photography, there was always 2 or 3 salesmen with Kodak film at every site, and somebody selling water or drinks at holy sites, and then souvenirs, of course. And people will come back and say, well, you know, Pastor, I'm disappointed. They got some old church there. Why did they have to do that? Why can't it be like Jesus? Well, we can answer that already. I don't have to tell you. You remember Christianity was illegal for 250 years, starting in 64. You remember that Christians were burned, sacrificed, tortured, otherwise intimidated from being public. There were no churches, except it ran in space in the outer areas. Governors took this persecution seriously. Some did, some didn't. Sometimes you have peace long enough to build a building, but then the next emperor would come in and round them all up. So we've gone 300 years about when there was no visible church. Now, the second thing, so St. Helena knew that she had to find Christian sites by talking to Christians and finding what they reverenced. And this is now Christians that were as far away from Jesus as we are from the Declaration of Independence. And the official policy of Rome was to destroy every Christian site and deface it. For example, today, next Sunday, we'll go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's also the Church of Calvary. It's also the Church of the death, burial of Jesus, because you remember, Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, never used, was just near the place of Calvary. Right? Now it's under the same roof. But it's flat. It's not the cave. Why? Because Rome defaced, destroyed every way it knew how, every Christian holy place. That was the policy of Rome. So St. Helena was smart enough to look for relatively new, not ancient, pagan temples. That's smart. We know she did it. When you get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre next week, we'll go to the place of Jesus' burial, which is just another building inside of a building on a flat floor. But Joseph of Arimathea's tomb was in a cave. But Rome was so aggressive about destroying every evidence of Christian and Jewish celebration in Rome and in Jerusalem that, well, the last time I really did a bit of research on this and talked to guides about it in Jerusalem, there were known to be 90 to 100 synagogues in the city of Jerusalem. Now, not the huge city we're talking about today, the little city we call the Old City. Archaeologists, in the chance of rebuilding after the big war in '67, when a lot was destroyed, and archaeologists have been able to find and document one of the 80 or 100 synagogues that we know were in Jerusalem in the first century. Now, the same thing happened to Christians after the War of 70, when there was the Jewish revolt. But by 70, Nero, 64, burned Rome. Legend is blamed Christians. The War of 70 now has Christians under the same thumb that Jews were under by the Roman occupation, and then by the War of 70, when these things were just wiped out. I've been to that synagogue's ruins, by the way. The second thing St. Helena did, not only was to look for Roman temples, first thing was to contact Christians. The second thing was find where did they worship. Second thing was to contact them or look for relatively new, only 100 or so years old shrines to the pagan gods, because that's likely where the Christian holy spots had been. Third, she begins in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. She begins in Bethlehem because, let's talk about this. Rome has been through 2 cities and 1 major rebuilding and dedication to Jupiter. Hadrian, when Hadrian fought the War of 130, Hadrian moved in and decided to rebuild Jerusalem because it had been heavily destroyed in the second Jewish revolution, rebellion, whatever. Hadrian is now emperor. Titus, by the way, Titus was the one that destroyed Jerusalem in 70, a reasonably moderate man. He allowed 100 or more crucifixions of people trying to escape the besieged city because he said it amused the soldiers and that kept up military morale. And the soldiers crucified people in the ways they had caught them, like if you were running, you were crucified running. that kind of thing was brutal. But Titus, among other things, was a relatively moderate general. He soon became emperor. He did not totally destroy Jerusalem, although he tried to destroy the temple. You can see the Temple Mount today because they couldn't move the ash logs that are in. They're about 10 feet long, 8 feet high, and 10 feet deep, square. We don't know today how we know where they quarried them from because we find the quarry in the shape of the stones taken out of it. But we don't know how they moved those stones and how they got them up 20 tiers high to form King Herod's great rebuilding of the temple. But they pulled down everything that was on top of the temple, all the columns and all that kind of thing. But Bethlehem is a little town today. Beit, by the way, Beit, B-E-T-I-T, Bethlehem, with the H down in your throat, Lahem. Bethlehem, house of bread. Interesting. There are 3 Baits, by the way. Bethlehem, we'll talk about today. So she goes to Bethlehem because it hasn't been largely destroyed. It isn't a civic center. It isn't a place where many temples would have been built. And she asked the Christians where they celebrated the life of our Lord. And as the story goes, they took her to the cave, and you got a picture of the place marked with a 14-point star in Bethlehem, in the Church of Nativity, in the cave over which the Church of Nativity is built.
Question. 14 turns up nowhere else in the Bible. Why 14-point star? Does anyone know why they picked that? That's a funny number.
If we go to Matthew, the first chapter, the 17th verse, we find out.
Okay.
There were 3 sequences of 14 Davidic kings until Jesus. Up to the exile, after the exile, from the exile to Jesus. Each one of them is 14 generations. So they couldn't get 3 times 14 around the stars.
Right.
It is the Messianics, as Matthew introduces in the first chapter, 17th verse. I went looking, Marcus, just the same way, and I took a long time before I found it. But it's right there, and I think I have it in the paper here. Remember, I wrote it last Monday. I don't know that. And I think if we are going to be strikingly and stridently honest, Matthew did a little cribbing to make it out 14, 14, and 14.
I see it here,
Yeah.
Page 6.
So, all of this is the story of what makes Bethlehem so significant to us and what the Church of Nativity. Church of Nativity is, you see on your very front page, in 2012, was made a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only one, by the way, in the territory of Palestine. There are some others, but not anyways. And why? Because it's the oldest continuing worship site. And probably, this is cribbing a little like Matthew did it, but probably it's the same kind of analogy can be made that we can almost say that this site might go back as a holy site to the year 4, because Bethlehem has not been repeatedly raped by the armies of Rome. It's just a little sheep town that grows wheat. Are you with me so far? Well, St. Helena then goes to Jerusalem, and that's next week's story, unless you would rather go someplace else. St. Helena will go to Jerusalem, and there she will do the same thing all over again. What do Christians in Jerusalem call their holy sites? And we know now that pilgrims went there from from carvings in the cave of what's now the chapel of St. Helena, inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There are Christian crosses carved in the wall there that are thought to be very ancient. So a guide now will take you, this is next Sunday, but just to, we can begin, a guide will take you to the outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and draw your attention to the stone laying pattern at certain points and say, this is the remnant of St. Helena's first church. We'll go there next week. Now, the other questions before I continue to get off the trolley on another direction. So this is all why we talk about Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, St. Helena, and the witness of 4th century Christians. And St. Helena kind of was using resources from all of them. By the way, she only lived about 3 years after this Holy Land trip. We're not sure. It's not like we can say about John taking Mary to Ephesus. There they lived in this house, which you sure did have that. And it isn't only Jerusalem, and it isn't only Bethlehem. On the Mount of Olives, at the place of the Ascension, there was also a church and the remnants of, with very few, of a church that St. Helena did at the place of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives outside of Jerusalem. So that's Jerusalem, but she also got as far away apparently as Egypt. This woman was 70 years old. I know how I feel just coming back from Salem, Virginia when I'm 70 years old. She apparently was at St. Catherine's Monastery on the Mount of Olives. On the Mount of Sinai. Because she built a chapel according to the histories, the rumors, the stories, built a chapel to, well, first of all, rediscovered the original burning bush that's inside the wall of that monastery, the Moses burning bush. The chapel there, beside the burning bush, is named the Chapel of St. Helena. And its date is of dedication is 330 CE. That's her time. She didn't see it finished, nor did she see any of these churches. Even 339 in Bethlehem, she would have seen the finishing of that. One other thing about the church in Bethlehem, as I said, it's not, the basilica is a 6th century rebuilding of the church in the long shape. The church in Bethlehem originally that St. Helena built was octagonal, just like ours. Just like ours, very popular. There's a church at Capernaum, the city of Nahum, broken down to its meaning. We don't know who Nahum was, but anyway, the city of Nahum, Capernaum. The house of St. Peter's mother is now a chapel. And that very early, and it's built a later version when it was possible to build a church, is built over the foundation of that shrine site, and it's octagonal. So that was, for some reason, in the early Christian period, a popular way to go. You can see it. They've built, the Franciscans have built a flying saucer over it. So, but you do look down through the glass floor that I was originally able to walk through it, but you know, pilgrimage is a business too, and people, as I said, people say, why did they build those churches? Well, That's the third way you preserved a site. If you preserved a site by just the rocks that were there, if I'm constantly fighting a battle. What the Romans did was desecrate the holy site by building a temple to a pagan god upon it. Just as Antiochus Epiphanes, 200 years before Christ, had sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. That's the ancients understood how you could desecrate, take away the use of the place. That's why they were just not discovering the holy sites. Where did these places happen? Learning from Christians who are resident there. But also, the sure proof of it was a Roman temple from that period. So when we go today expecting it to look like our Sunday school papers, it's not going to do that. And what we hope to have is an ancient church that tells us that from 4 BC, or so to speak, till now, this has been the place. Are you understanding what I'm saying at this point? Changing things. So the ancient church sites and the ancient ruins of church sites are indications to us that from a very early time, this has been revered as a holy site. Now let's talk about the church a little bit. It's a fascinating place. Cruise ships have ruined it. There's no water near it, but there are buses that can get to it. When a cruise ship unloads on buses, there are 10 or 12 buses. We've been there then and you can't get it. Let's look at the picture a little bit. I called it picture the door of humility. The Crusader Arch, because the Crusaders did a lot. Crusaders were only there 200 years before they were driven out by followers of Islam. But they did an awful lot of work. They were junkers. So they sometimes destroyed things we would like to have had in order to use the materials to build something they wanted to build. So we find nice stones in junk buildings that are Crusader era, but the Crusaders also did some very good things. They're trying to retrieve some of the damage done by the constant wars and earthquakes, the earthquakes in the area of the Galilee. And by the way, Bethlehem is about 5 miles from Jerusalem. But Jerusalem and on up into the Galilee are tremendously bothered by earthquakes. And rumblings, aftershocks can go on several years. And it has been devastating to the Church of the Nativity as an example. You see the birthplate of Christ on 5. You see the point, the 14 points of the stars and the star. You can reach your hand down through that hole there and ostensibly touch the place of the Nativity itself. And just to your right and behind you is a crib area where animals would have been fed in this cave, where Jesus would have probably slept. The idea that the mangers we set up like little stables of the place Jesus was born is probably fictitious. First of all, he wasn't born in December. Every time we sing the hymn, in the bleak midwinter, I think probably not. Shepherds would not have been out in the field by night in December, or even maybe in June. If you look at a map, you will see that just east of the Holy Land is the desert. And in July, we had a director to Albright School of Archaeology, where I was residing during a sabbatical period. We had a director who wore a scarf at night when he walked out at night, because he said, "You're going to get aches in your neck if you don't put a scarf on." Well, I didn't. To me, it felt very warm. But anyway, Bethlehem is just 5 miles away from that. And so earthquakes are a problem. And on page 5, you'll see, or several paragraphs, you'll see the description of that kind of activity. And then the birthplace of Christ we talked about. Now let's look at, remember seeing those columns, those rows of columns. If you look on page 6, we didn't look at that earlier. On page 6, you'll see a dark, the building's dark. First from the smoke of the ubiquitous hanging lamps that are tradition and Orthodox theory. You got to light everything with a oil lamp. And after years, it kind of clouds up the joint. But you'll see the 2 rows of columns that you saw in the picture there. It's the left side of this picture. The nave is the center, right, going on the right side of the picture, right inside. Then on the other side, there's 2 more rows of columns like that. That's the basilicus type. It's holding up the roof. And you see the chancel up in front, and then finally the Holy of Holies of the sanctuary back behind the Reredos screen there. But you also notice the hole in the floor. The wars didn't do that, the archaeologists have. There's actually a row of those holes down this long area, because the floor is marble. The inside was marble, and the church outside was marble, and that's what was stolen during the Ottoman period. But those holes, they have covers so you don't fall in. And church meeting there, they'll cover them up. But those holes uncover a beautiful terrazzo floor that's thought to be Hellenic. Beautiful. It's about, I don't know, this far from the present floor. It's thought to be part of the building of St. Helena. The World Monument Fund had, in 2008, put it on the watch list of 100 most endangered sites because it is in dire need of severe maintenance. Interestingly enough, President Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who wrote the script for former President Trump's attempt to keep power, was elected for 4 years and he served for about 12. And has not been particularly friendly to the church. But he's the Palestinian Authority president still. Has managed to raise up several $1 million of Palestinian money for the maintenance of this church, as have 2 other large groups. And so some of the work you see in the paragraph below, which quoted defines the work that needs to be done, has been done and very successfully. So the roof, for example, has been rebuilt and just finished a couple of years ago. So there is some maintenance being done. But it's a precious, to the Palestinians, it is the most significant site they've got on that territory. And so though they are majority Islamic, the Palestinian Authority seems to be able to find money for and interest in preserving Christian locations that are ancient. And then turn to the last page, and that we're done, except the question right now. Here is Manger Square in Bethlehem. By the way, that open area, look on page 1 again. It's easy because it's the last page and the first page. This whole big area here opens up into Manger Square in downtown Bethlehem. And the stores are on 3 sides of Manger Square. And this opens into Manger. This whole area plus Manger Square is part of this crowd on Christmas Eve every year still. There is a tradition that the mayor of Bethlehem is a Christian. That tradition holds, even though the Christians are a very minimal part of the population of Bethlehem today. But every Christmas Eve, including the last one, it looks like this. And sometimes you see a pan of it. If you ever watch the midnight mass from Bethlehem, that mass is broadcast from the Roman Catholic Church, which is built, by the way, alongside of the Church of Nativity, the ancient Church of Nativity, and it's called the birth of the Church of St. Catherine. And I thought I told you that the monastery of Mount Sinai is St. Catherine. Well, St. Catherine is a teenage saint who, as a teenager, was tortured to death. They put her on a wheel. Any of you studied studied medieval means of torture will know about the wheel, the rack, other such things like that. She was put on the wheel as she died there. But she appeared mystically on Sinai. So we have the Church of St. Catherine in Bethlehem, and we have the Chapel of St. Catherine at the monastery on Sinai. Now, was St. Helena there? Legend says yes. The date is the right date. So it has a bit of, and of course, the monks at Sinai were, well, of course she was here and named after her. So, and the burning bush, there is a bush that looks terribly burnt. Do I think it's Moses' burning bush? I don't know about that. Do I believe it might be St. Catherine's Chapel? Yeah, I think that one's got just a spatial possibility about it. Questions or comments? We have a couple. Thank you very much for cutting out with my rambling.
Thank you.